First, I sincerely want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today, taking time out of your schedules to come, spend some time with us, go through the presentation. A lot of different agencies here today, and that's great. That's exciting for us to have a turnout. Having our partners here to come listen to us, work through this with us is really important. Today is going to be more than just presenting rates. It's really going to be a bit of a deep dive. And so our goal is really to go in and have our presenter present to you some key findings of some of our research that we've had, the outreach, sharing with you the outreach we've done to other states. If there's something I want to stress right out of the gate is that this was not done in a vacuum. This was truly done with our consultants' help, with administration's help. We've done comparisons with, I think, around 34 other states across the nation, and we've actually had the opportunity to work closely with a few of those states and having them kind of share some of their experiences. The states we've worked with are very similar to Oklahoma in their technological journey, so it's been very relevant. Many of you know, because we've said it quite a bit, that we haven't changed our rate since 2016, and that's why today is so important. With the years that have passed here recently, technology's changed a great deal already. The technology advancements that we're trying to gain as a state, our security posture, our security needs as a state have changed dramatically. And it's really important that we set our rates at OMES in a way that we can not only recover what our costs are, but continue to move the state forward. Like any infrastructure, it's critically important that the state invest in its technology infrastructure. As you all know, in your agencies, the technology we use can be really core to how you serve the citizens and how you achieve your missions. And so it's important that we as a state continue to invest in that infrastructure and the technology. Oklahoma, when you look at our technological footprint, we truly, as an enterprise, are one of the largest and most complex technological enterprises in the state. And so it's important that all of us working together to make sure that we're doing everything we can to align our strategies going forward, the projects that we're doing together, and how we move the state forward, really with that goal of becoming a top 10 state. I want to thank all the agencies that have worked with us. Again, this wasn't done in a vacuum. It was done with the state's input, with many agencies that worked closely with us to help not only our consultants understand what some of the challenges were, what your needs were, but working closely with OMES, and then again working with a lot of states. So I want to thank you all. For those of you that work with us closely, thank you for that time. I also sincerely want to thank our new state leadership who's been instrumental in this project. Our Chief Operating Officer, John Budd, who's also the Director of OMES. Our Deputy Director, who's with us today, Dow Hughes. He's the Deputy Director of OMES, and they have been fantastic and truly engaging and spending a lot of their time working with us, working with our user groups across state government, and making sure that they felt like we were pointing in the right direction. So really big thanks to their support and guidance through this project. So with that, to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to do today, we have Bill Fournette. Bill Fournette is with the Persimmon Group, a company out of Tulsa, who has been our primary consultant on this project. He's got a lot of information he's going to be sharing with you all today. He's not only going to be going through some of the updated rates, but the potential for some funding model changes that I think we all could agree with would be great. He has worked with key members of the legislature in presenting this material, making sure that they're aware. Since many of us work closely with our different appropriations chairs and committees, it was important that they be aware of this information. And so he's been presenting every step of the way with those folks, making sure they also agreed with the direction in which we're going and understood what the challenges can be from a funding perspective and how we can maybe do better with some alternative funding models and maybe some direct funding from the legislature to help offset some of the costs that we have at IS and that the way that we're billing those charges back to the agency. As you all know, we've been in this cost recovery model for several years now. That was directed in statute that we be a fully cost recoverable organization. But we also know there are a lot of shared services across the state that we at OMS are providing to all agencies, and it becomes a bit of a money shuffle. So I think there's some opportunities there in working with the legislatures to determine some better methods of doing that. It's a little cleaner, it's a little less burdensome on all of us that are working so hard together to achieve the individual missions of the agencies and to achieve the technology advancements that we need to keep our state safe and our citizens safe. So with that, I'm going to have Mr. Bill Fournette come down and kick us off in the project, in the presentation. And obviously he's going to be presenting a lot of material as we go through it. I believe he is open to questions as they arise because the idea here is, guys, that we really want to do it as much a knowledge transfer. It's not just a rate presentation, here's what the rates are, but helping you understand the methodology behind it, how we got there. And so making sure that you understand that is important to us. So please feel free to ask questions as we move along. Make sure you're comfortable with what he's presenting and that you understand it. And in many cases, you're able to go back and articulate these changes to the rest of your agencies. So with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. All right, so what I want to start off first is what the project was. What we focused on this project was trying to make sure that we've got rates that are valid from an OMES perspective, that are sustainable, they're clear, they're understandable. One of the things we heard loud and clear also from agencies is we don't understand what went into the rates. So we've worked through all of those aspects. The second is to make sure that we have rates that are able to support a zero recovery model. IS is not in the business of trying to make a profit. Okay, but it's also a real challenge in a zero recovery model because if you're not exactly 100% right as an agency or as your IS counterparts in your estimates, you're not going to recover. And so we took a lot of lessons from other states that have been already working through this approach to figure out how did they come back with and overcome those same challenges. So a couple of things that I want to walk through of who we worked with. So Bo mentioned this a little bit earlier. We worked with IS leadership. We worked with state agencies, both at the cabinet level as well as through the IS advisory group. We worked with OMES Finance, and we spoke specifically with 3 different states that are very similar to Oklahoma in that they've already gone through consolidation the way Oklahoma did. They had some challenges a few years in, and they had to resolve how to overcome those challenges. We took some great lessons from those states, and you'll see some of the recommendations that we had from that. The second thing that we had is that we went through and we've also spoken with the legislators. So I've spoken both with Senator Thompson and Stanislawski, Thompson over Appropriations, and Representative Wallace's Appropriations Committee as well, to get them aware of what we were proposing because these rates do have an assumption around an annual direct appropriation amount. And I'll talk through that as well. All right. Timeline. This is what we did over the last several months. This finished up a week ago with the presentation and approval by GTARB of the fiscal 21 rates. Just to kind of give some clarity on that as we've gone through it, we had not had rates approved since 2016. So we did have, especially on the part rates, we've had a lot of renegotiations and price changes. And so you're going to see some of those as we go through because we have not had over 3 years any kind of an adjustment. Some of the things that we got from the agencies as far as feedback that I wanted to give you is first was, overall what we heard from agencies was the desire to partner with OMES. One of the things that was very striking for us is that with the way the model has been to date, if you're an agency, you only pay for the hours that someone from IS works for you. If you have an idea for a project and you don't have your funding because you don't know how big the project is, you don't necessarily want to pay to bring a project manager or a business analyst in to help you determine if you even need a project because you may not have the dollars available to be able to pay for those hourly resources. Agreed? That decentivizes the understanding of what the project is early on. And one of the things that we saw was that we had projects that after we made the vendor selection, maybe after we already got the project going, in the middle of the project we would realize that what we thought we were getting wasn't necessarily what we were getting. And part of it was because we rushed through the beginning of the project or project definition. Because agencies were like, I don't have the dollars available, and you're bringing somebody in from an IS perspective, therefore we're going to kind of run with it on our own for a little while. That's a fundamental challenge that the rates don't necessarily, they can help a little bit with, but it was a challenge that we were seeing that was causing issues in our execution of our projects and causing some budget or cost overruns. So one of the things we saw with the rate model you're going to see, especially on the labor side, is to change the equation in that conversation. To say that you've got people that are assigned to you as agencies, if that's what you want. You can have dedicated resources. Therefore, you know who you have, and you can call them in early in the conversations while you're trying to define the project. The other thing that we heard was talent side of making sure do we have the right level of talent, performance, and everything else with IS. One of the things that we've been seeing in general is that IS has been seeing a reduction in the headcount because they've also been dealing with, from a cost and budget perspective, of where those gaps are. We know everybody may deal with some of that, especially around the compensation and comparisons in the marketplace. But one thing I do want to stress is that IT is competing against the private sector for resources. And as a state, we have to recognize that, because if you're a .NET developer, you're choosing between a Chesapeake or a Devon or the state. And that's a challenge, because if you want the talent, you've also got to be prepared to be able to fund or pay for the talent as well. So we had to take that into consideration with these rates as we looked at the rate models themselves. On some other themes that we had was there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. And as we talked through that, we looked at things especially around billing transparency. And we heard loud and clear of, I get 628 or application maintenance is the part that we heard repeatedly. We're not sure what went into application maintenance. And we wanted to be able to clean up that transparency so agencies should be able to see what went into the rate, what they're being charged for, and we view it almost like getting your phone bill. And you should be knowing that, if at all possible, going into the month or the year as opposed to after the fact. Now for projects, that's a little different animal. You don't know that till after the fact. But if you know that you've got a certain number of phones, a certain number of desktop, which you already get that with your app Cs, you should know that going into your year. The same is going to be true on some of the labor aspects you're going to see that we're going to talk through. All right. Oops. All right, areas of agreement. We looked at some different models when we worked on the rates themselves. One of those was around what we call the hybrid. The hybrid is a mix of direct appropriation funding with agency funding itself. And as we worked through this, we wanted to also get approval around some design principles of which the rates were going to be defined by. This slide I do want to hit a few things on. This is a key finding slide that sums up, as we went through all of the assessment, that we needed the rates to be able to address. So a couple of these I want to hit. First is going to be, on average, just so everybody's on the same page, IS has been having a $15 to $20 million annual gap of funding. It finds out after the fact, because their focus has been trying to make sure agencies are supported, and then afterward just looking up and saying, hey, wait, here's the dollars that we spent, here's our gap. We want to shift that. We want to shift that so that we go into a year knowing what our forecast, knowing what the agency's needs are, and making sure we're aligning expenses and headcounts to those needs. The second is, but understand that the gap's got to get paid somehow and somewhere. And what you're going to see in this proposal, or actually what was approved, is the legislature's going to pick up some of that, and the agencies are going to have some of that as well. But that gap exists. The second that I mentioned earlier already was about the billable rate not being viable as it currently is. We did have a lot of products that had losses, and we really worked through that. We know certain products affect all of our agencies, like Essential Desktop and Essential Voice. And we were very cognizant of trying to be very cautious in trying to look at what the rate should be so we could recapture costs without at the same time having a massive impact on agency budgets. So that was a lot of conversation to say, how do we start to get better aligned to a break-even point for those types of rates without causing a single substantial impact. I'll talk through that when we get into the rates. On the desired IS staff, we had several agencies that said we want to have dedicated staff. We'd like to have them assigned to us, and based on that, then we'll fill them with work. That's something that was brought into the rate model in consideration. After the rate model this morning, I'm going to speak briefly about prioritization, because all of this is kind of going hand in hand to saying what are we expecting as we go into a year. All right, oops. And then a couple other things is we want to maximize the federal dollar recovery as we go through this. So for those agencies that do have it, we wanted to make sure that we did not trip a wire that would cause an impact on your ability to recover federal dollars through the process. Number 6, how many of you all are familiar with the 1025 contract, which is the IT staff augmentation? All right, a few. So one of the things that we did when we did this analysis was we did two things. First of all, we looked bottom up as far as the expenses and costs from IS. Do these products break even? Are we losing money, or are we making too much money? The second is, we also looked at how the market compares for these same things. The 1025, for those who aren't aware, is essentially a master contract that the state has with certain vendors to provide supplemental staff for IT. Those rates are pre-negotiated, and they are by role. So business analyst, different levels of business analyst, project manager, different levels of project manager, application developer, etc. We compared those two to say, if you as an agency had to go into the open market with the rates that have been negotiated already on behalf of the state, how would this compare? To ensure that you're also getting a price that is adequate, comparable in the market, and or better than the market in cases to be able to support your needs. I mentioned earlier about IS has to run like a business, like a private sector business. It does, because of what it's competing against. Last couple that I want to hit, though, is what we heard from the other 3 states, and especially Utah, Tennessee, and Missouri, who are at or really sometimes up to 5 years ahead of where Oklahoma is in this journey. What we heard was, we've got to get rates established a year in advance. And that would allow an agency to be able to go into its fiscal year budgeting cycle better prepared, better aware of what adjustments may need to be made, versus finding out during a legislative cycle or finding out once the budget requests have been submitted. The last couple here are around governance and also around trying to establish some sort of a capital working fund, which other states have done, where dollars, if they are over-recovered up to a certain amount or can be directly appropriated into the fund, that really serves 3 purposes as we see it. The first purpose with that type of a fund is it allows for an unplanned, unbudgeted event like a cyber attack to be able to have dollars available for the state and IS to be able to respond to that. The second is it allows for the rates to, like the insurance business, to not have these swings based on, say, a vendor renegotiation of a contract. It allows you to smooth out some of those rates if you do see a rate change fiscal year to fiscal year. So don't hit me with such a dramatic change, smooth that out a little bit. And thirdly is it can be used sometimes for internal or capital projects that could then improve the overall enterprise efficiency from an IT perspective. So other states were doing that. They were using their dollars, if they had an over-recovery up to a certain amount, to say, let's use that to put it right back into the state. The other thing that's out there, though, that the other states did, is that they did forecast a over-recovery, because you can see on an annual basis, you don't always know how many projects are going to come in, when they're going to start, from when we thought they were going to start. They also brought in rebates, and they would do a mid-year review and see if they were trending towards an over-recovery. They would do a rebate to the agencies. All right, so this was a way that other states overcame the challenge of how do you do a zero recovery when you have a lot of unknowns going into a fiscal year from a technology side. All right, and I say that because what we also heard from the other states was it took 2 to 3 fiscal years for them to get their numbers honed in. Because that assumes that as an agency, you know exactly all the projects that you want to do going into a year for me to be able to estimate or assume the headcount I need to support you. It means the quantity of the products that you're asking for, I've assumed correctly with you, and that's the same number we're going through the full year, no changes, because if I have a change, I now create a risk for either an over or under recovery on a fiscal year. So those were key findings. I want to stop for just a minute. Any questions around the findings that we saw from either other states, from listening to the agencies, or from the analysis? Good? All right. Okay. So these were the design principles that we heard from the agencies and that we heard from IS leadership and finance that we wanted to work through. And that is, we had to have clear accountability. We wanted predictability on the rates. We wanted to be able to see where those rates are. We wanted them to be consistent. And I will say that we took both some work that we had done back in 2017 and 2018, as well as some of the PFM studies, to make sure we were taking the lessons and the observations from the different groups that have been looking at this problem and these challenges for a while to say, how do we get something that's going to be sustainable? So here's what we also heard from the agencies of the desired behavioral changes or improvements that they'd like to see. One was improved project performance. And I will say that we believe that based on the rates that are proposed, we see the opportunity for improvement from a couple of different aspects. First is being able to look at the resources and the people that we have to make sure we're getting to the right head count. The second is it gives some ownership to the agencies and being able to say, if you want an additional developer or 2 developers, that's a conversation that you can now have to say, I can plan for that and I can fund that. And thirdly is it changes the conversation away from how many hours are you going to work to come in and ask me if we need this project or not, to I've got you, if you're dedicated to me, come in, let's have the conversation, let's figure out how do we proceed forward on the project. Okay, there were 2 aspects that we looked at here. One was the updated, just pure updated rates with a fully burdened rate. Fully burdened rate is everything that goes into those individuals to be able to cover the IS costs that are the consistent recurring costs that are at the enterprise level. That is different than project costs, where you as an agency may have a project for 1 fiscal year, it may run over into a 2nd fiscal year, but then it's going to go into more of an operational life cycle thereafter. The second was we looked at hybrid, and the hybrid is the one that pretty much everyone has settled on, that we put forth to GTARB. The conversations that we've had with the appropriations committees as well is based around the hybrid model. The hybrid says, let's have some sharing. Let's have certain things that at the enterprise or state level, the legislature can directly appropriate, and then let's have things that are specific to agencies or controlled, the decision is controlled, like headcount within an agency with your HCM system, your human capital system. That is something that agencies have proportionally, and it affects each agency different based on the number of headcount. But the financial system, as an example, is determined, the cost of your financial system is determined on the state budget. So that's going to be one of those things that you're going to see that we're going to recommend direct appropriation for. Okay, so here's at a high level. This is the little number equation of how this works out. If you look at fiscal year 21, and we also, by the way, ran this against the fiscal 20 data, so there were a lot of things coming off of the true-ups from fiscal 20 that many of you, if not all of you, went through, that we wanted to leverage as current and consistent as data as possible. And OMS, Finance, and IS really worked to provide that. $184 million right now is the forecasted expenses. Now there's an asterisk on that because everybody's still going through those budget conversations. So that will adjust based on the projects or the needs from the agencies here over the next couple of weeks as well. On the left-hand side, so you start with the expenses. You take in the middle the 2 funding buckets. On the left-hand side is a direct appropriation amount, a parts amount. And there's two numbers in that parts amount. It is $83.8 million or $75.5 million. The reason there's 2 numbers there is it depends on which direct appropriation the legislature goes with. They've given us their indication of which appropriation amount they want, which would mean right now that would be a $75.5 million revenue coming into IS for parts. So your voice, your phone, your storage, your cabling, your network, all of those type of things are all coming through through parts. On the right-hand side are your other funding sources. So this is the direct appropriation. It's the pass-through amounts, which may go up or down based on the year. It's the OI fund revenue, and it's the federal grant funding. Those may change a little bit on an annual basis, especially the pass-through. But we saw the pass-through amount, which is $45 million there right now, will go up or down, and the expenses go up accordingly for the agencies as well. So that to us is kind of removed off the table. But the fiscal year 21 direct appropriation amount that we're assuming and planning against is $24.8 million from the legislature. We've reviewed that with both the House and the Senate. That right now is the recommendation that they would like to go through, and I'll show you what's in that appropriation here in just a moment. But that dollar amount is what we're basing the rest of this on. So you take the $181 million in expenses, you deduct the dollars that are summed up between these 2, which is $75.5 million and $71.1 million, and that leaves you a difference. Everybody with me so far? That gap then has to be recovered by the 267 chargeback headcount that you see there at the bottom. Those chargeback headcount are primarily going to be PMs and BAs, application developers, and IT strategists. Those are where we've taken an assumption as we work through this that says roughly 80% of those resources will be dedicated directly to agencies. The other 20% will be 50% utilized by either pooled agencies, and so agencies that maybe don't need fully dedicated resources but want to pool together, and that's one of the things that we're working through, is to say where they're like applications, like platforms, where they can pool together and they can work their priorities with the team that's supporting that set of agencies. And lastly, it's for certain projects that are really large statewide projects that we want to ensure that we've got coverage across those vendor projects. So 80% dedicated, 20%, 50%, the assumption is 50% utilized. Those are all going to be billed based on hourly rates. And I'll go through that here in just a moment. But that is how you get to the recovery. So each year, those three factors. Factor number one is the parts revenue, to make sure parts are breaking even at least. Factor number two is the funding amounts that we get from the legislature and other sources. And factor number three is that gap with the number of headcount that are then providing and supporting that fully burdened rate. Any questions on the basic formula and math on that? Everybody just wants to get to rates, right? Okay. All right. Here's the three direct appropriation amounts that we reviewed, and we ran numbers. We actually ran numbers against 5 different ones. Left-hand side is 16.7. What you see in the bullets underneath that is what would be how we came up with that number, and in the red for each of those as you move from left to right is what is an addition to drive those numbers. Now the reason for these direct appropriation amounts was to say what are things that at the enterprise level, at the state of Oklahoma, security is a great example. Okay, cybersecurity is a requirement across this state. As you all have seen just even in the news and just the events that can occur, both public and private sector, it is a basic you have to have. 10 years ago, pre-consolidation, 7 years ago, it was not as big of a factor as it is today. It's a must-have. Okay, the administration side, the service desk, because everybody may call into the service desk, is to say those are things that we can say and justify and support a direct appropriation amount for. The financial system is the same thing. Agencies right now are paying for the financial system. You are paying well below what the expense is for that financial system, and I'll show that here in a moment. But regardless, the view we saw is the state decides the budget. Therefore, that's a great candidate to be appropriated by the legislature as opposed to across all the agencies, because regardless of whether the budget goes up or down, that number will go up or down accordingly, and the legislature ultimately decides what that final amount is. Okay, and then on the far right side, you'll see we had some additional with enterprise architecture, IS quality for core support, and data-driven services are all potential candidates for direct appropriation. Any questions on that? All right, so let's talk rates. I'm going to first go through labor rates, then we're going to go through the product rates. So the labor rates had a substantial change in the model. Today, you're billed only for the hours that are worked. But here's the challenge. If I have a developer who's assigned to you to support your application, I know and a piece of feedback we also got from agencies is, I'm not always sure who's supporting me. I used to know, but I'm not really sure anymore. So we changed that whole model, because in the model of today it says that if I think my team is going to work 40 hours a week to support your application, but you only give us 20 hours a week of work, I'm now 20 hours in the hole every week in that model. So what we found from the other states, and we really leveraged that as well, was to essentially switch the whole model around and say, for those agencies that want dedicated assigned resources, you'll have dedicated assigned resources. And if you have 5 FTEs or full-time equivalents assigned to you, you will pay for those 5 full-time equivalents 2,080 hours a year, which is a full-time equivalent, times the rate. Now, if it's enhancements, if it's support, if it's a project that you have, and they can be filled with the resources that you have, because you're still going to be prioritizing, the team has to know, what should I work on this day versus that day? You're still having those dialogues. Okay, this is not a deconsolidation at all. This is still having, there's certain enterprise standards and approaches we have to maintain, but agencies have support, and they know who's supporting them. In that approach, then you've got a model that says for 2,080 hours times that rate, this is what I'm paying for. Okay, that's the big difference on this. It allows for agencies that are having federal fund recovery, you have a clear rate that you can use to be able to go and recover your funds on that. IS will be having a conversation with you all then to say how many resources do you expect or need to have to fulfill your projects as well as your support for the year. That will be an ongoing annual conversation as you go into each year. And that will allow then IS to be able to estimate, see where their gaps are, their needs for headcount, and is it going to be full-time? Is it going to be staff augmentation because we only need them for 6 months? Or is it going to be something where you're working with a third party outside, like an integrator, through your pass-throughs? Okay. So to that end, these are the models themselves. Today you have a model that says you pay $90 an hour for a project manager, regardless of whether they have 2 years of experience or whether they have 30 years of experience. This model shifts, and you don't pay for a project manager per se, you're paying for 5 tier rates on labor. So what that says here is that these are the 5 tiers. Across there you'll see kind of the resources, but the tiers start at $65 an hour, and they go to the very highest level of 110. So 65, 75, 85, 95, and 110 are those rates. Okay, that's what the tiers will be based on. Here's what this also means that we heard as we went through this. Unless you have a federal funding requirement today, if I have a business analyst 2 and a project manager 1 both working on a project, and this is for projects as well as for those dedicated headcount. If I have a project manager 1 and a business analyst 2 working on the same effort, and the business analyst gets done in 20 hours of the 40 hours that we estimated, and the PM needs an additional 10 hours beyond what we estimated, you have to do a change order. It's got to go through that whole process of approval. Unless you have a federal funding requirement around it, you don't have to do that because you're being billed at the same rate. It's just 2 different individuals. Okay? This allows then for an agency that if you look at that and you say, you know, I want to have a project manager 2 assigned to my agency for fiscal year 21, you can now do the calculation to see what that cost would look like and plan for that accordingly. Part of the intent here is just as you get an AppC with a monthly invoice that says here's how many voice and here's how many essential desktop you have, you would have the same thing going into every month. Here's my 3.5 FTEs, here's the roles that I have, and I already know what my bill is going to be unless during a fiscal year I realize I need something more and I want to go add a resource to that. Just like you do on the product side. So these are for dedicated labor headcount, but the rates themselves are across all labor that you would have for projects as well as the dedicated headcount. Any questions on that?
How did you come up with the hourly rate?
Great question. So let me show you that. So here's how we came up with the hourly rate. Oops, we did 2 things. Moving fast on me. All right. The first one that we did was we did a bottom up of looking at, like I mentioned earlier, what is the actual expense that's left over from the parts and from the other funding sources, and what does that leave as far as a fully burdened rate that needs to be recovered. We looked at by the banding, the salaries, and the ranges essentially, and what else is in that fully burdened rate. That was the bottom-up approach. The second that we did though is we also looked at the market. So this is what this slide shows right here. These are all of your roles typically that you may have on a project with the rates in green on the left side. What you'll see is we compared those to your 1025 contracts. So if you have a choice to say I'm going to go to an IS resource or I'm going to go to the 1025 with vendor X, here's the high and the low rates of those 1025 rates, and in red what it shows is those vendor averages. So as an example, you'll see an application developer 3 or an application developer 2 is $75 an hour to an agency in these approved rates. But right now, the average on the 1025 for that same developer is $92.21 an hour. So we looked at that, and we looked at the number of vendors that were in the 1025, and we did a comparison to say, based on these revised rates, where does OMES IS stack up against those vendors? And to the right of it, it'll say the OMES position. Position number 1 means you're the best value. You're the lowest rate. Okay, position 8, you'd be the most expensive rate. And so what you'll see there is that for most of the rates, OMES is right there in the middle to the better value end on the 1025 contract. This also enables OMS to be able to compete on the talent side as well against some of those vendors to be able to make sure that you're also getting the talent that you're looking for your projects. Today, many of us, if we've got a seasoned project manager or a seasoned senior developer, we want them. We want them over the more junior developer. But the challenge on that is you're being charged the same rate on both people. So we burn out our senior developers because you're getting a really good deal on some of those, while our junior developers never get to come up through that level. So this gives some control back to the agencies to say, what do you want? What level of talent do you seek? And here's what you can expect to pay for that talent based on that. Okay, our big driver was we wanted to give agencies some control over the direction of their fiscal year and their IT projects. Yes, sir?
Why not just pay their salaries and benefits like other companies?
Sure, because here's the challenge on that. Then who's going to pick up the tab for cybersecurity on that aspect? Or who's going to pick up the tab for enterprise architecture that you need to be able to have as a state? Because that is what you see as the efficiency. So there is other things in addition to that, into that care and feeding, that goes beyond just a labor burden rate, which is just their salary and benefits. It also allows us to be able to say that if we've got people, how are we going and recruiting and hiring? As you all saw, at times pre-consolidation, some agencies had a lot of dollars and they could go pay a certain amount for a developer that was above what another agency might have been able to pay for that same level or same type of developer, and that created some real competition inside the state itself. Instead, what we're saying is let's treat the state like its own organization or business. Let's treat IS like it's a vendor and say, now what do I want or need as an agency? At the same time, IS, what I'm expecting from you is to ensure that at the enterprise, I'm getting value because I'm either getting general or enterprise license agreements, which is intended to be able to cost less than me as an agency to having to go negotiate that myself on the product side. Secondly, it enables me to be able to say there are certain things as a state that we want to take advantage of for either security or efficiency across our platform that you all are able to have, where when we were all separate agencies, we did not have that. So in that case, that fully burdened rate is what was the gap or what was missing and needed to be able to come in to be able to support that across the agencies. Just like a business would. Okay? As a business for myself, my back office, I've got to recover their costs and expenses somehow, and I have to do that through my rate. The same is true for IS. Did I answer that? Well, yes. Oh, sure, I will do that. So, yes, that question was around why not just charge just the labor burden rate, which would be just their salary, say, and benefits. Yes?
Just a follow-on is that.
Sure.
I thought you said that was going to be handled with the direct appropriations and those efficiencies will be handled through that.
Sure. Parts of it are, depending on what can be direct appropriated and what the legislature comes back with. So if there were certain aspects that the legislature said, okay, we're going to go and appropriate everything across the enterprise, you're right, that would reduce those rates down. But we wanted to get something that's realistic in conversations with the legislature. If the legislature came back and said, we're going to direct appropriate nothing, these rates go up. Okay, so we ran the numbers, including a zero direct appropriation, which was not pretty either. Yeah. Yes.
One thing that's different from hiring a vendor through the 1025 and going through IS is we have more control over if the vendor didn't produce what we paid for. Whereas IS, we don't. We don't have control over cost overruns. We don't have control over the system not working after we paid for it.
Yep.
So that's where I think we would need some more control if things don't work out.
Sure. Sure. So the question, so the question was that one of the differences between a 1025 vendor or contract or a third party, even outside of that from an integrator side, versus OMES IS is that you have more control with the external vendors around performance during the project or the support or effort, and performance after it's, say, been deployed as well. Is that fair? So the challenge on that is, you're right, that is still a performance question. I can tell you that having worked with IS leadership, they're all circling around how do we improve performance? How do we get better visibility between all parties, between the agency and IS, because that's part of it as well. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we saw when we came in initially as Persimmon over 2 years ago, just to look at project performance. And one of the #1 factors that we found was that neither side, IS or the agencies, were having the conversations early enough to ensure we had clarity of what we were trying to achieve in a project or a need and why we were. And so we both got off on a wrong foot, and in doing so, it set us into a bad place as we went into execution. And things like the invoice confusion and the lack of transparency just compounded all of those issues. So I'll say that what has been being worked on right now within IS is everything from governance to performance to the rates, to say how do we also get some control back to the agency. So you're exactly right, and this is, the rates themselves are not going to solve overnight the performance issue at all. That is still an ongoing conversation to establish how do we improve the performance, the communication and awareness, and the choices between the agency and our IS that need to occur to achieve the level of performance that you as agencies are expecting. So I absolutely hear that. We heard that loud and clear. We know that's an issue. It is still going to be an issue, but we do believe this takes a step towards changing the dialogue a bit more and trying to improve it, which was one of the things was, I don't know who's supporting my apps. So how do I even trust the invoice that's coming in sometimes because I don't know everything that went into that? Now I can have a more explicit debate. And if I have a resource that's assigned to my agency and they're not performing at the level, I know who that is. I can have a conversation now with the IS, the IT strategist, or whoever's over those resources to have that dialogue. Yes?
So, comment, I guess. I think one of the things that causes frustration is exactly what you're talking about, which is we get a line item we don't know what we're paying for. And so, in this situation, if I have a $60,000 a year employee, I know what my employees cost, but I'm going to pay $120,000.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to feed that frustration. So wouldn't it be better to have a straight labor rate and then set your gap fund off to the side so we know what we're paying in labor costs?
Yep.
And what we're
Sure.
giving to support millennials?
Sure.
Just, to me, it just kind of makes better sense. The other comment I would make is with regards to vendors. When you're paying for a vendor, you're paying for their building, you're paying for their advertising, you're paying for their equipment and training. We pay for all that with our dedicated staff. They're in our building. We pay for the training. So I'm not sure if that's...
Sure. So great question. So the question, I think, kind of sum it up for those that are on the call as well, is that why did we not just go again with a straight labor burden rate? Because some of those things that are overhead or fully burdened, for some vendors, that may not be an apples to apples comparison with what we have in IS. And the second is I can always see exactly what those charges or those costs are. So I'd say two things, and I'm going to hit the next slide just to kind of share that as well. So the second comparison, I am going to answer your question, is that we compared against 35 peer states that use the rate model as well. And on every one of those, in this proposed rate model, Oklahoma is better than all of them, including Utah, and I would say Utah as a state is the furthest along of consolidation. They have gotten through a few years where they almost fell backwards into deconsolidation, and they pushed through. So Utah was rich with a lot of lessons. But I share this because two things. One was federal fund recovery was one of those considerations. For agencies that have federal fund recovery, you want to maximize that, and every one of these states did the same thing. The second thing that we wanted to look at was, agreed, marketing may not be something that IS has, although I would say that they do have some strategic communications, but it may not be at the same level of a company with a sales team. However, what they also have, though, is that other companies don't necessarily have, is they have all of their internal infrastructure and architecture that's required. When you go buy a third-party vendor, you already know the architecture you're going into because that's part of what you're doing during your RFP or your reviews and vendor selection cycle. You know what you're getting, but you're buying one product, one vendor, whatever that may be. When you look at the state, IS is having to look and broker applications and platforms as well as needs across more than 100 different agency boards or commissions. There is a need, a value there, and I would say that to date, one of the biggest challenges has been some of those most strategic enterprise functions have been so focused on ensuring agencies' needs are being met that they haven't had the time that they want to be able to have to even go forward to the next level. So everybody went through, because who was here for consolidation? Most everybody? So the first pass was Physical. PCs, licensing, email systems. That's the easiest part of consolidation. The hardest part is as you go forward trying to say now, where does it make sense to have distinct systems and where does it make sense to have consistent ones? How do we leverage that as a state? How do we shift off in some areas around legacy platforms where our issue is not necessarily even cost, our issue is risk? Where in some cases you may have developers or resources that are no longer available, they've retired to support those. So those are balanced at a state level, I agree, that are different and beyond that what you have with a third-party vendor. And those are some of the choices of the state as a state that Oklahoma has to continue to have the dialogues on. One of the biggest questions I've gotten asked from the legislature is what happens if we have a revenue shortfall? And the challenge on this, and the example I use, is a house. If you own a house, there are certain things that you have to pay, you've committed to, like your mortgage, like your electric bill and your gas bill. And if you don't, your house goes away. There's other things like a kitchen remodel that I can choose to do. And the question is going to be as we go forward is, as a state, there are certain things in IS you have to have. There's other things that are choices. Choices by an agency, choices by a state, choices by IS. Those are all conversations. And I will say with this model, just so everybody's aware, everything, including inside of IS, is running through this model. So there's not a IS-only view or process, and then there's an agency-focused process or view. This is, everyone goes through it, including on the prioritization when I get to it. Because we need as a state to be able to say, here's the resources, whether that's dollars or funding or people. Here's the resources that we have. Where is the best place for us to be putting our resources? And inside of an agency, the same question is happening. Where should I be putting the people who are assigned to me or I have available on my work? And if I want more work or more people, then I have a choice. Okay? So that's the labor rate. Did I answer? I mean, we looked at that. We absolutely did. The challenge on it was that by putting it into a fully burdened rate, it helps, one, on the federal fund recovery, and second is that it looks at what is across IS that cannot sit inside of a product. So I'm going to show you here in a product. Oops. We could increase products rates on some things, because we're still under recovering a little bit even as we go into fiscal year 21. But what we felt was that the impact that it would have on certain agencies, or all agencies, would be more substantial, and we wanted to ease towards that. Okay, but that's the three factors. Please, if you take nothing else besides the rate updates, there's three factors that are driving the rates. The part recovery, the external funding, and the headcount based on what the remaining expenses are. Okay, so with the products, we went into fiscal year 20 with 166 parts in the catalog itself. What you see is that we're going into fiscal year 21 with 89. So we're trying to simplify and reduce that part schedule down. Now, some of that's because IS is turning over the decision and the act of acquiring a PC, as an example, through the lease agreement with Dell to the agencies. There's certain software they're turning over. They are continuing to review to say, are there things that we can give more control back to the agencies on, and they can go seek themselves. So that is an ongoing conversation to look at that. But here's what I want to share is that on those parts, we recommended the removal of 79 of the parts. We also added 5, and those 5 that are added are directly from application maintenance. So application maintenance as a part goes away in fiscal year 21. That was kind of a big miscellaneous catch-all. What we heard from agencies was that can be confusing at times. So now you're going to see there is an explicit part for a virtual server, for a physical server, okay, for database maintenance and licensing. So you're going to see some of that was buried in 628 or in the application maintenance part has now been pulled out. And then the rest of it's recovered through the chargeback rates. What you see at the bottom is the parts that we looked at. How many had significant losses, profits, etc.? And I'm going to share this as we kind of work through this. So you have a handout that we gave you that shows you the fiscal 20 to 21 part comparison, as well as the second page is all the parts proposed for removal. A lot of those you'll see are leased, or they're some of the Microsoft or Adobe products that now agencies can purchase directly. So these parts up here have no rate change. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly unless you have a question. Some of these are pass-throughs, some of these are like OI. Others are, you'll see, is around the network, the voice side, and some of the server storage. Those are not changing. Okay, second page is the same thing, which is getting into some of your Plus desktop and some of the security certificates if your agency or organization uses those. All right, next one's going to be the new parts and rates. There's 5 new parts. So DHS's servers were inside of the app maintenance. That's been pulled out as a separate part for DHS. The physical and virtual mid-range servers are also being pulled out and put into where agencies will have a billing, so you'll see what the quantity of those is. The IIS license maintenance and the platform licensing, those were all in app maintenance. We have just pulled them out, so now you as an agency have better visibility into what it is you're getting and paying for. Okay, all right. Reduced rates. We have 4 that were reduced. On the right-hand side, what you'll see up there is the percentage of reduction. So this may not affect a lot, but the VPN access is probably the greatest one. There were 4,500 of these, and those are being reduced by 25%, which is reducing it from fiscal year 20 at $120 for the year to $90 for the year. Okay. But as I mentioned earlier, as we did the analysis, it's been 3 years since we've reviewed the rates, and we had 4 that were able to be reduced. These are the ones that show increases. Now, there's a couple of these. First, the one in red, that is the core financial system. So just to give an idea, IS has been having on its books a nearly $6 million expense. That's the gap between what it's been charging agencies for the financial system and what it has to pay Oracle. Okay, so that's right there, $6 million. So what you'll see there is that that's in red because if the $24.8 million direct appropriation is approved by the legislature, that part will not be charged to agencies. That part will be paid for by the direct appropriation. So on the right-hand side, the biggest one is the CFE environment. That is another one where we were under recovering substantially. You'll see here we were under recovering by almost $3 million a year that was going into the Center for Excellence environment. Okay, so that's an adjustment as well. The other one that's out there is 596. So 596 affects almost all agencies. That's your site connectivity part. I put down there in the bullet for you to kind of get a sense of where we tried to make choices. So in that case, the current rate for connectivity is $2,352 a year. To actually break even, it should be at $6,365, almost triple what it is being currently charged at. But to do that, that would have been a massive impact across agencies, and so we made a decision, a choice, and the recommendation was that we increase it, okay, still substantially, by 50% to $3,500. So that's one where it could have been much higher. We looked at those parts that we thought would affect a lot of agencies, and we tried to be cautious in trying to not have a substantial impact. But we've got to move towards some level of a break even. The others in here, I wanted to highlight a couple of others. 589, which is your server storage per gigabyte. Okay, that one also has been $3 a year. It should be $5.14 a year, but the proposal is to increase it, or actually the approved rate now, has been to increase it only by 36 cents a year to $3.36. Okay, so that's another one where we made a decision to not go to the full break-even rate because we understood the impact it would have on agencies. 661, 663, these are the essential desktop computers. Same thing there where it could be at 733, that's what the break-even point is right now, $733 a year versus 660. But we increased it only to $680 a year, which was a 3% increase. Now, as an agency, I know you look at that and you go, these are increases. Yes, we know. We had a $20 million gap. The legislature is picking up roughly about a third of that gap. The other 2/3 is coming from either parts and or those labor rates. Now, to that point, one of the things I would say to be watching for, and I'm going to get to it in a moment on the timeline, is going to be every year you should be expecting some changes in your rates. Some may go down, and especially over the next 2 years as you're kind of honing in the numbers, and some will increase depending on the negotiations that we have with our vendors and the costs that exist out there. And some will go away because they may be turned over to the agency so that they can go purchase either on the open market or through some sort of a enterprise-wide agreement negotiated on behalf of the state with a vendor. All of those are on the table. Okay, these are being removed from the catalog themselves, and what you'll see here on the removal is most of our removals are leased, or as I mentioned, the Adobe or Microsoft licenses. Now, if you're an agency who's in the middle of a lease that you're still working through and you're not at end of life of that lease, you will continue with the same rate that you've been working on. There's no change on that until you go end of lease, and then you'll be able to go directly with Dell if it's on the computer, or with Microsoft if it's for Visio or one of those apps. Okay. Any questions on those rates? Yes, sir.
Currently, we're being charged separate rates for core financial and core HR.
Yes.
I'm not seeing core HR listed on.
Yes, so core HR is actually also referred to as HCM. So human capital management, you will still be charged for HCM. I will put it back up here. It's a very slight rate. There was a very slight increase on it. Let's see. It is $730 right here in the middle, core employee management system. It is going from $66 a year to $78 a year. And that is to break even on that. Yes?
On the, excuse me, PeopleSoft financials,
Yes.
where you said if they appropriate the 24 million, would that include non-appropriated agencies as well? We wouldn't pay?
So that'll be covered across the entire state.
Okay, if they don't approve?
Oh, sorry. The question was if for the core financial system, if it is directly appropriated, will non-consolidated agencies have to pay for that as well, or still have to pay for it? The answer is no. It would be appropriated, paid for directly by the state.
So if they don't do that, how much would it?
So if they do not approve it, it will go up from $660 a year to $1,920 per year, and that is the break even. Yeah, just so everybody's clear on that, and that is being driven by the overall state budget that determines the licensing or cost amount with the vendor on a per annum basis, and it's, I believe, 1 year in arrears, meaning that right now we're approving it on the fiscal 19. That rate's based on the fiscal 19 budget, I believe. Yes, ma'am.
When y'all spoke with state agencies, did y'all speak with any non-appropriated state agencies?
Yes. You can who?
Oklahoma Tax Commission.
So tax commission was one of those that we
Not tax,
spoke.
I'm sorry, accountancy.
Okay, the accountancy board. So question was, did we speak with any non-appropriated or unconsolidated agencies as well? We did, yes. So yeah, so as we look through this, ultimately what we came back to on the parts side, I'll tell you the parts was the easiest in the sense of it's explicit. You can go in and see this is what a phone costs, this is what the labor, or this is what the storage costs or the server costs. And we have now for every one of those parts, there is a breakdown of what went into the cost. So now, if you're in December of this year, calendar year, and you're renegotiating a contract with a vendor, and it affects 3 parts, then that's where going into the next fiscal year, they can already start to see what that part effect would be, positive or negative. Meaning if it goes up or down, they can start to see that because we have a breakdown of all those parts. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat.
Okay.
They're asking, what is this?
Oh, the CFE environment charge, that is for the Center for Excellence Data Center and the servers to support that. That is mainly being used by public safety and the agencies around that. So that will not, if you're not one of those agencies that's using the CFE, that data center, the Center for Excellence, then you're not affected by that part. While what I would say is in the past, what you've seen, agencies, if you were not using that data center, you were being affected by some degree by that part because it was likely coming through in the overall burden or impact around, say, app maintenance. And so that's been a challenge, is we wanted to create clearer line of sight so that you as an agency can see what goes into those part pricing. And then ultimately now, You can see what comes in on your invoice or through your App C when you negotiate that on an annual basis. You know what you're getting for that particular item. Okay. Again, back to one of our key principles was what we heard loud and clear from agencies was transparency. And I know for agencies, when some of you look at that, you're like, okay, this is increasing some of these are going to increase my budget. And the challenge, we know that. We've had a $20 million at least gap that's been building. But the key is let's get the course correction in. Let's put a process and a model in place that allows, as each year goes forward, now the conversation, you have clarity and transparency, but you also have some control to say, these are the projects I have, this is what I need. Okay. All right, any other questions on the parts? Good? All right. Okay. All right, with that then, what I want to put up here is a timeline. So part of what we did on this also was to look at how do we make it so that everybody understands what's coming up and when. Let me hit this up. Let me get this. All right, here we go. So this is the fiscal year budget timeline, fiscal year 21. It's compressed, we know that. And there's not much else we could do having coming up off of the true-ups from fiscal year 20. Making sure those, getting the App C secured by the agencies because we wanted your latest App C data coming into these rates to make sure before we go before the legislature and GTAR, we've got the rates at the right level. Here's what you see is that there is 2 weeks ago, and I'm going to go to this in a moment after we finish up the rates, but 2 weeks ago, your agency director should have received an email from IS asking for two things really, a call for projects, which is for fiscal year 21, asking what projects might your agency be looking at for fiscal year 21 so that the IS team can also start to engage and understand what that may look like from a headcount or from a expense side. The second one was to start considering, and since you just came through the true-ups, is looking at fiscal year 21 and on all of your products, the ones I just went through, what's the quantities? Are they still valid? Are they going to go up? Are they going to go down based on what you're needing as an agency? Those two things feed into, ultimately, IS and your agency or organization having a budget submitted on October 1st. Okay, that's compressed this year because we're sharing with you these now and you've got a week and a half roughly till October 1st. We know that. And we wish we could have done something differently, but we were unable to because we literally just got these approved from GTAR. But traditionally, some of that dialogue was occurring in January before the legislature came in. So we're trying to get ahead of some of that right now as well. So that is to have a conversation. And as an agency, I'm going to give you some next steps to coming out of here or what to be looking at. But the key is we get those in so that as we go through the legislature, we've got rates that are secured now till next year. This is what we want it to start looking like. So what this shows here instead for fiscal year 22 and going forward is that by the 1st of July, okay, which is by my understanding is by statute, there should be a call for needs or projects or quantities for the subsequent fiscal year. That allows then between July and the middle of August for IS and the agencies to be dialoguing about what your technology needs are, that will feed into a request for GTARB for any adjustments to rates for the next fiscal year by the middle of August. That then gives agencies and IS 6 weeks to continue to work and finalize their budgets. Okay, that's what we want to get to. That allows us to be much more proactive. The call for projects, we know we may not get every project that you're thinking of, but the intent of the call for projects is it goes directly to drive potential headcount assignments from an IS perspective to say, what do you need? Okay, that's what the intent here is, to be able to say, let's get forward on the budgeting cycle. It allows for agencies to be able to get rates approved almost a year in advance of when the fiscal year starts, but more than 18 months, almost 2 years in advance from when the fiscal year ends, meaning fiscal year 22 in this example. Okay, would this be helpful for you all? Having a timeline like that says, let's get earlier into the conversation so that you can be working your budget and those dialogues and saying, you know what, based on that and based on what I'm seeing in my budget, I can't do that project this fiscal year. I need to pull back and maybe shelve that for the following one. Is that helpful? Okay, that's what part of this intent is try to get more proactive, more forward-looking with transparency. Okay, so with that, we put a few FAQs up. A couple of things, and IS is working to have on a per agency basis a fiscal year 20 to 21 comparison. So you could see, here's what you were paying in 20 based on your AppCs, and here's what it looks like in 21. But there's a couple of caveats that you need to be aware of as we work through this. The first is, you're going to see on the rates, the product rates, those are pretty clear. Those are going forward, except that you have 5 new rates. The second is, your app maintenance goes away. Now, for most of you, that was probably the bulk of your technology budget, was your app maintenance cost. That's going to be replaced with those 5 rates, but also a conversation you need to have with your IT strategist around the dedicated headcount, if that's what your agency is wanting. If not, it needs to be talking about what do you believe those projects are looking like, so that IS has a sense of what may you need to be supported, both in your maintenance and support side, as well as on your project side. Because those rates also don't have project rates. Because the project billing rate goes away in that sense because we have replaced it with the labor rates, the tiers, the 5 tiers. The second is that being able to look at it and saying, do you believe or do you see any change in those quantities, and that would affect up or down your agency and the cost for that specific project. Now, if you look at this and you see a product that you think your agency needs and it's not in the catalog, it's not on that list, that's a conversation to have with your strategist to find out where is that particular product or need. And now, part of that's because some of those products may be specialized. Like, for example, if there's a specialized resource or something that was needed, or if there was something that's not in the catalog but your agency needs, so you can get an answer back of, do you go get that directly? Is it go through pass-through? Or is it something that IS or purchasing is working to secure? Okay. All right. A couple others that we've got. Oops. Is comparing your fiscal year AppC, as I mentioned earlier, is that's where the conversations that you need to be having between your agency or organization and IS over the next week and a half is with your account executives and your IT strategists. All right, that's why they're generating those comparisons, so you can get a sense, because we know we're in a short time frame here to be able to get that. Okay. Any other questions around the rates themselves? Yes, sir.
So how does dedicated staff cost rate factor? So if I have somebody, say I have 5 dedicated staff and one gets hit by a bus or wins a lottery, they prefer. One wins the lottery and quits, and I don't
Sure.
have anybody for 6 or 8 months.
Yeah.
How does that?
Sure, great question. So the question is, how does the dedicated staff, and I'm going to say the same is true, by the way, on parts, affect us, where if there was a change in the middle of a year, not from an agency's direction, but from the staffing side. Okay, so 2 things. First, from an agency side, I'm going to take on that piece. So where you want to get to is, you want to be able to get to, as you go into each year as an agency, you've established what your commitment level is for your product parts and your headcount. That's considered baseline. That is what IS uses to be able to make their expense and forecasting adjustments, and the agency for their budgeting side. If, as an agency goes through the year, you realize you're going to add staff to your agency, and you need to increase HCM or the employee management system, that kind of thing, then that's where you would be, you would see that increase or that change going into your invoice based on it. But in that case is, so long as you're staying within that commitment level of your baseline, if you drop down again back to where your baseline was, it would adjust accordingly. If you said I needed temporary staff for 3 months, but then I'm going back down to my 5 FTEs as you related, that would go back down to the 5 FTEs, but you'd be charged for those 3 during that temporary period. But if on the IS side, you have gotten the commitment of the 5 FTEs, one of those FTEs in March says, hey, I won the lottery, I'm out of here, and it takes 3 months for IS to be able to recover that, you would not be billed for those 3 months. Right? So that is the challenge. Now, if you as an agency come back and say, I committed to 5, now in March, I'm going to drop down to 3. That's a conversation that has to occur with IS because they made decisions on acquisition and or resource assignments based on that. So the key is, just like we do in our own budgeting, was we make certain decisions, and that if there's something that can be discretionary or changed during the middle of a fiscal year, that is a conversation to be able to have as soon as possible with your IT strategists and or account executives. But as you're going into the year, the intent is to be able to have a commitment. Okay, and one of the things that we're also looking at, I would say, in addition to this, is to be aware, besides the capital revolving fund, is we have heard from some agencies, if they were able to go ahead and be billed on the front end early, that for those dedication, just like you do with potentially with parts, on the front of the beginning of the month, to be able to have the ability of doing that, they desire that ability. So that's one of the things that's being looked at as well as to assess. Can we get that ability out there? Because one of their concerns was being swept potentially at the back end of the year by the legislature and to try to mitigate that risk. And so we're working through that piece as well with the legislature. Okay? Great question. Any others?
The only thing I would say is that OSBI kind of had dedicated staff for a while.
Yeah.
It's a way to go.
Yeah, so OSBI is giving a shout out to dedicated staff of liking that. I think in general, what we've heard and seen from those agencies that have started to do that is that they actually are sometimes even asking for additional staff. It changes the conversation. Again, the key is, to the point that was asked earlier, was around performance. That is still a dialogue. I would say also, from what we've seen, because our focus was not on that dedicated model fully, is that the dialogue between what's enterprise in the state and what the agencies have full control over as well, that dialogue needs to still continue to happen, because you guys are you're going to have to work through that. I mean, that's where you want to get. You want, as an agency, you want to know, hey, if I've got direction, I've got choices, and you told me this is my capacity of choices, I'll make my choices. On the IS side, it's saying, you said you needed this, but we also have a couple of needs over here. We've got to make sure we're still following our architectural patterns, our infrastructure requirements. We got to make sure as a state, we're also protected and prepared as well. And that's, by the way, not unique to any other large organization that we've worked with as well. That's a common question, and it takes collaboration and dialogue to work through that. All right, the last thing I want to leave you guys with on the rate side is, here's what you need to be thinking as a takeaway. The first is, you want to get your fiscal year 21 budget. Okay, IS has been generating based on your fiscal 20 APCs, what that looks like, but know that you still got to have the conversation around your head count as it relates to projects as well as support. So if you've got projects, you want to be having that conversation with your IT strategist. The second or the third one is you don't forget to go back and review those quantities on the parts for fiscal year 21. Because IS is not looking to bank a fiscal 21 budget off of fiscal 21 data if it's going to change in your agency. They need to know that. That plays into their factors. And some of the agreements that the state have are enterprise-wide agreements, which says they're using your information from an agency to determine the rate or the license costs with that vendor in their negotiation. And if that changes after they've made the negotiation, now you have a gap. And that's what you've had in the past, is trying to figure out how do you get that more aware of how everybody can be working through it together. And lastly is, if you have questions, go to those account executives and IT strategists. We've been discussing this. They are going to be armed, being able to have those conversations with you to answer the questions and work through the questions, especially around headcount and or if there's price changes. Any other questions on the rates? Yes, ma'am.
My handout doesn't appear to match some of the information you went over on the rates.
Okay.
You mentioned something about reduced rates. Is there a more updated version?
Sure. So the reduced rates are in the under the title that says keep update rate. So we didn't have it separated between a reduced versus an increase on the handout, but under keep right there on the very first page, the question was, are the 4 reduced rates in there? Those 4 reduced rates are in the keep-update, which was all of the rates that had any change to them versus keep the rate aligned. Yes, sir?
So you know we can't really see the PowerPoint.
Yes, so we'll get that out to you as well.
That's what I was going to say. So you'll get that out?
We can get that out to you as well. Yes, sir. Yes. Okay. Yes.
Can you get it out today?
Yes. All right. And there's the spreadsheet that has all of the rates in there as well. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this is a question for you or someone else,
Okay, so from my perspective, sorry, no on that. We know some agencies had boards and or like there's a couple that had federal reviews 6 months ago even. So I understand, I appreciate the challenge on that. My challenge is going to be that we've from an agency side is do the assessment, see what your impact is. My advice would be, and then be able to decide based on your agency's relationship with the board how you need to proceed. But I would say if you see a real issue or gap, raise that up, please, again, with your IT strategist or account executive.
If you're talking about from an agency that's going to be requesting funding in your budget request for this, and this is going to make it late now, or you're going to need to update it, if you will just work with your budget analyst, and if you need to hold back on submission because you need to run this by your board, then we will make a note out to the side of your agency that waiting for approval based on IT rates from your board will submit later, or something like that. So if that's what you were going for, then just make sure and work with your budget analyst, and we can make a note of that if you aren't able to get your budget in, your budget request in on October 1st.
Okay, thank you. There is a question up here I saw also that says, I understand the cost of the core financial is just a proposal for the legislature funding. Should the, can you hit the see more on that, Amy, for me?
Should the agencies include the increase in cost?
Should the agencies include the increase? Okay, so, yeah. So the conversations that we've had so far with the legislature is both the House and the Senate have said, and we know it's, they cannot commit until they're in session, but that they are going after the 24.8 million, the center number. From an agency perspective, Brandy, what do you recommend on that one? Should they include the core financial in their estimate or not, or in their budget?
Right, so I would, these rates are approved.
Yep.
These are the approved rates. So I would move forward
Okay.
based on these rates. If the legislature determines something different in session, then that's a conversation we'll have in total across the
Okay. The only thing that changes on those between the two appropriations, like the 16.7 versus the 24.8, is literally just that core financial rate. That's the only thing that's different between the appropriation assumptions. Okay. All right. With that, then, I'm going to just, since we had everybody here together, we want to talk through prioritization. Just a couple of slides on this, because this kind of plays into that call for projects that are going on. So prioritization. How many of you all are part of an ITOC, of an agency oversight committee? Just one or two? Okay. So this is taking across now all of the state prioritization. And so I just want to give a quick highlight of what we've been working on. And this ties back to that email that went out 2 weeks ago just to get an initial call for projects. But as we start moving through the year, you'll start seeing more dialogue and coming around this. How many of you all have some sort of a prioritization review of what projects or technology enhancements should we be having within our agency or board? Okay, good. So think of that at that level. And what we have here was, how did we create some enterprise criteria? Now there's some assumptions around prioritization. And we are, again, looking across the state. A couple of those is to reestablish, and my understanding is in the state, we had at one point an annual call for projects. This gives IS better clarity about what could be coming to start those dialogues. That's something that we want to be able to start having, and you saw earlier, even in fiscal year 20, for fiscal year 22, it'll come in earlier. That helps in the budgeting cycle. The second part is going to be IS is continuing to establish and add their architectural standards, security standards, etc., which also enable you all as agencies, when you're using a third party, to ensure that if the third party is going to produce something for you and in the state, it conforms to our expectations and standards where we have those, especially around security. Governance is going to be based around risk and or conflicts. So the risk means, what's the risk to the state as a whole? So if we go and modified all of our websites or deployed a new website tomorrow and it blew away some of your agency's functionality, that's a high risk. We want to make sure that that's taken care of. The same is true, say, in our financial system. We want to make sure before we change things, we're going through a very disciplined approach of assessing that. The second is conflicts. Conflicts are typically going to be around resources. Okay, if I have 2 people or 1 person and they're being asked to be on 2 projects, how do we choose which project they're working on? Large customers may have, have dedicated resources that we've already, these are our base assumptions. Customers will submit requests that have been vetted internally. So one of the things you're going to see on this enterprise prioritization is we're going to be moving towards an intake, meaning a request that for a project or need that it has a designated person by agency that internal to the agency, they can dialogue about it, but the request comes in from a single point of contact. That allows an agency, because we've heard this from several agencies, where an executive director or a leader in the agency sees what IS was working on, they go, why are you working on that? That's not something we need. But it came in from somewhere else inside of the agency. So what we want to have is that one voice, that point of contact that says, my agency or my organization wants blank. IS is going to use this process as well. So things that were typically considered internal or enterprise efforts will go through the same prioritization effort regardless of whether it's IS or an agency. And lastly is this process applies to all non-defects and non-operational maintenance requests. So if it's enhancements, if it's new projects, that's what would come into this. All right, now, just to give you a sense of the priority, there are 3 types of projects, and those 3 types of projects will go through prioritization slightly differently. So on the far left side are what we call enterprise projects. Enterprise projects are things like the core financial system. They touch regulated or what is considered system of record data. We want to be very careful before we change those, and so the early stages of assessing what the request is it the right value, should we do this ultimately, is what enterprise projects fall into that category because they can affect other agencies across the state. On the opposite side of that is what we call the innovation projects, primarily digital transformation. These are things that are high risk that we can say, you know what, we're going to try this and it may fail. It's okay. We're willing to take that chance. And those are things that need to go through the process quickly. We have a great idea, here's a need, let's try it. In the middle are customer, which would be like agency, or domain-specific projects. So I'm an agency, I have my application, I want to be able to go through and prioritize the stuff that's on my application. That's going to go through the center. Because you know your agency, you're not affecting other agencies, you're not affecting the enterprise or system of record data, and therefore we want to get you through this process faster than what you would see on the enterprise side. Everybody with me so far? Cool? All right. So to that end, from a governance side, there's 3 essentially kind of bodies here. Down here on the bottom, you have your agency or customer or domain ITOCs. Those are your oversight committees that are looking at the requests that are coming in. If it's a domain, that means it's because it's like agencies. Or the application may support multiple agencies. It's just choosing what it is we want to be able to have. ITOCs, for those who are already on them, those ITOCs are going to remain and exist. We want to be able to now get those into some other areas of the state so people can look at what they're working on. If you're a smaller agency that may not have dedicated resources and you've got pooled resources from IS supporting you, somebody has to decide what those resources work on. And that's where an ITOC for that area would come in. On the innovation ITOC, that's a faster one that's under Secretary Ostro and that team, but it's got representation from IS just to ensure that we're not affecting security risk, architectural risk, infrastructure risk, and we want to be able to get those through. Above that, okay, is what was called the Enterprise Review Board. That is chaired by Secretary Budd as COO. It's comprised of cabinet secretaries, Bo as state CIO, and it's looking at enterprise projects and projects that have a conflict because the resources are being asked for from, say, an agency that are also now affecting an enterprise project. And that is to give the priority between those needs. So this is to provide governance. Ultimately, the Enterprise Review Board sees the decisions that are being done by the ITOCs just to understand what's going on in those areas, as well as the innovation ITOC. But you all, if you have an ITOC or an agency today, you're going to proceed forward doing that prioritization review. Okay? Now, my recommendation, and I've seen with other clients we've done the same thing, is that if you're an agency and you have a lot of enhancements, a backlog of those enhancements, we recommend that you consider one intake request that has these enhancements on it and says this is a release that we want to do. here's 30 enhancements that we want to have to our application versus 30 intake forms. Okay, because this is going to come in, and IS is then going to review and start working with the agency in that dialogue to assess what ultimately is the business case and what is the cost for doing that. Yes?
Question for you. When the customer understand agencies have ITALs, they prioritize their projects. Some will have dedicated resources. Some resources will have to be pulled from approval. How do those get prioritized?
Great question. So the question was for agency or customer ITALs that may have dedicated resources, but they also need some resources that are being pulled from other parts of IS, like a network or server specialist as an example. That's not dedicated to your agency, but you need them to be able to get this project going. Those are going to be, that's part of where that assessment inside of IS is occurring, because they're watching to say if there's a real conflict, then does that need to be escalated for a prioritization decision of A over B on projects, or do we have an overarching capacity constraint, which is why the annual call for projects is important, because if IS was to see a number of projects coming in, and one of our assumptions is agencies, you've had a lot of pent-up demand, and that demand is going to start increasing. But IS needs to see that ahead of time so they can say, I need to be able to staff up in this area of my organization to better support this slew of projects. So the key is if it comes down to a real conflict, Shauna, then at that point, it may be raised up for what's the priority if the agencies aren't able to sort that out themselves. The Enterprise Review Board essentially is sitting above all that, saying if people can't come to a resolution, we'll work and give an answer. Yes, sir.
So, I see this as problematic
Okay.
for our agency. Just in the time it's going to take, the systems that we have, like for example, our Otis system, it serves 248 law enforcement agencies around the state. The reason it's been successful is we've been able to make enhancements on the fly.
Yep.
They say, I need this, I want it, and we can get it done because they need it right away. Same thing with our APHIS system, our criminal history stuff. So those things now are all going to have to go up through this before we can start on that?
So question is, if an agency right now is able to make changes really fast on the fly, are they going to have to go up through this whole escalation or process in order to get those changes? The short answer on that is if you already have a prioritization like an ITALC itself, this doesn't have to take a lot of time. I want to put in here, I'm going to show you why. Let me give a couple things on this. Okay, so this is an overall process, okay, to answer your question, that starts over here at the beginning where it's in gray, which is an agency's having ideas in a conversation. IS doesn't even know about anything until it comes in where it says gate 0 or GO, it looks like go, right? That's the request that comes in. What an agency is doing is a quick justification, and if it's a small enhancement, these are going to go through this process really fast because it may go straight from 0 all the way over to G3, which is to go execute, to go actually make the change. So it does not have to go through every one of these stages depending on what the change is for. If it affects system of record, at that point it needs to go slower because the risk that you have is you have the potential impact of affecting other areas or regulated data, system of record data across the organization that needs to have some level of an oversight or review to say before we make this change, what else are we going to impact? Does anybody disagree with that? Because that's the basic premise on that piece. That's high risk. But in that case, if it's internal, I know it I see it with my team, I know what that change is. First of all, before I put that request in, it's probably happened I've already had a conversation, and I can get it before a review. And a review board here does not mean that or an ITALC does not mean it has to be a convened ITALC. Okay, what most states and agents and organizations do on that is it can happen right through an automated workflow. So for example, IS coming off of this has already created an intake form through Office 365 that was sent as part of that link for that call for projects. You can put that in there and it allows them to get that information, see it immediately, and start to do something with that. So it can go through quickly, and I want to show this of what that looks like because we know sometimes you have choices. That's what that can look like quickly, where essentially the request comes in. You may have, here's 5 enhancements that we need to have by the end of this week, and I put that in and it can go through that process quickly. The key is Are you having a dialogue with that strategist or director for you all with dedicated resources so they know what's coming and they can quickly assess and say, here's the choice. My developers are tied up on this other work. Is this higher priority than the other work? And you all can say, yes, as an ITOC it is. Now that he's still that person, he or she has still got to make a decision of what's the effect, what's the impact it's going to take. It's going to take 3 days. It's going to take 5 days to develop it. We've got to test it. What's that look like? That dialogue can still happen very quickly. This does not mean this process has to take and go really long or be overly burdensome. The key is, do we know what we're doing, why we're doing it? Do we know what the choices are between one priority or one item and another item? So everybody's on the same page.
So I think applying it kind of unilaterally across everything doesn't make much sense to me.
Okay.
If I have a program that is internal or, doesn't tie into those other things, at least consider making an exception for programs that are assessed, that don't impact anybody else, and allow us internally to do that.
Sure. So I will tell you, we did discuss that. I mean, we looked at those. In most organizations, and it has not been here at the state, there is some level of a high-level business case or justification of why we're making a change. Now, some organizations will make it very financially driven. We know for some agencies that does not work. It's a value, and sometimes that doesn't equate to a financial number. But the key is being able to say, it's answering a basic question. Just because we could do something, should we do it? And making sure we're on the same page, because here's what's happened at times. Sometimes we'll see, and I'm talking in general, a yo-yoing of choices of what we should be working on. Other times it's that maybe we're working on the wrong things. Other times we're directly aligned, implementing the things that are tied to that agency and their strategy. And the direction that you want to be able to get to is to say, I can still move things through quickly, and there's certain things that you'll see on an intake form that may be mandated, and they will fast track those things through there. You can escalate them and move them through much more quickly through a process if that works for your ITOC. But the key is, if anybody's working on something, there ought to be a basic sense of they're working on X, we can see what X is, what's the status of it, is it on track or not, back to the performance question. And the second is, do we understand why we're doing that? That may be a sentence or two in some cases, and it may be a full business case on really large, higher risk projects. So I think the microphone is dying now. Other questions on this? Okay, so here's your takeaway on this. First, on the prioritization, we wanted to share this with you. It's going to be coming and rolling out. The main thing right now is your agency or your organization should have from that email about 2 weeks ago, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, a link for call for projects for fiscal year 21. That's the thing for you to take away or focus on first, because that will help to validate and bring into the conversation over this next week and a half headcount and or need conversations as you go forward. Yes. Do we submit multiple enhancement requests through the project intake form? So short answer to that is yes, that's what we recommend. What most organizations will do is say, here's a set of 10 enhancements that we've been building up, and you put it in through one intake request form as opposed to 10 different request forms. That allows also, because here's what this does for everybody. Okay, IS, and I'm sure as an agency you feel the same way at times. We have a lot of ad hoc. It's a what am I working on this week, and suddenly it changes on Tuesday because of something that occurred on Monday, but did we really know about it on Monday or did we know about it a month ago? You're trying to slow down a little bit of the pace where it makes sense. There's always going to be some things that have to move quickly and that you have to react to because of that. But not everything does. And the state's, by the way, not alone. I work public and private sector. Everybody's gotten into fire drill crisis mode. You try to slow down the pace a little bit so people can do a little bit more conversation on the front end to also answer the question of, should we be doing this? Does this really need a technology fix, or is it just a policy or a process fix? Those can also happen. And so understand that's part of what you get, hopefully you walk away on. I know rates are one of those things that are affecting you immediately, but the whole purpose here is to try to get things, one, more into an open dialogue and transparency, and the second is more on the front end, being proactive in planning and preparing so we're all aware of what we're assuming and thinking in our estimates and our budgets, as opposed to reacting to it on the back end. Was this helpful, at least explaining it? I mean, I know some of the news for some may not be like we don't like the news, but was it at least helpful in trying to understand it? Yes? Because we want feedback, because we got 2 more of these on Thursday. So if you have feedback, please get with myself, with Cindy, with any of the IS team over here as well, and we want to take that, because we want this to be, we want to smooth out. We know we're disrupting you. We know we're affecting you. We want to smooth that out as much as possible. We're trying to not bring extra pain if we don't have to. All right, with that, I'm happy to stay afterwards for any questions. Thank you all for your time today.